She lay unmoving on the cold carpet just inside the corner room of the Woodward Inn. A single gunshot wound to the back of her head. Her blood pooled, dark and glistening, staining the floor, the sheets, the light that came in through the cracked door. Her friend later recounted how there was black streaming all over the floor when police found her. Those were the last moments anyone would ever see of Ashia Davis, a 3-4-year-old transgender woman full of dreams, compassion, laughter. Less than 20 minutes before, a teenager walked in. Less than 20 minutes later, he walked out. Only Ashia did not leave alive. If you could rewind all of it, perhaps you could glimpse the moment that tipped everything, the message she sent online, the nervous pause before she met someone new, the steps down the hallway toward danger she could not yet foresee. That is where our story begins. Ashia Davis was more than a name on a crime report. She was charm to her friends. A black transgender woman who had just completed nursing school, a soul who gave meals to the unhoused, who rescued abandoned pets, who offered comfort to whoever asked. To Ashia, being a nurse was not just a job, it was a calling. She believed in tenderness, in care, in living truthfully despite the weight of a world that often judged first. It was the 1st of June 2023. The first day of Pride Month, a day meant for celebration, recognition, freedom. Ashia, like many, understood both its promise and its fragility. That evening she connected online with a young man named Carlos Lamar Scotland, aged just 17. The messages were brief. The meeting arranged at the Woodward Inn, a modest hotel perched on Woodward Avenue in Highland Park, near Detroit. Privacy and discretion were part of the plan. Or so it seemed. At about 10:57 p.m., hotel security cameras picked up Carlos entering Ashia's room. He had arranged the meeting. She had opened her door. They stepped inside. For Ashia, perhaps it was a chance at acceptance, maybe connection. For Carlos, we cannot yet know. The cameras show life slipping toward tragedy. 19 minutes pass. At 11:16 p.m., a figure seen hurrying from the room. Unanswered phones begin to ring. The door remains locked from inside. When hotel staff forced entry, they found Ashia gone. No sign of movement, no words to hear. A single gunshot wound through the back of the head, execution style, according to investigators. There was no chance for defense, no suggestion of struggle with a weapon in hand. Ashia's phone, text messages, calls, they all remained, preserving her last exchanges. Carlos had left. No one else had entered or exited that corner room during the critical span. The police arrived. The crime scene was taped off, the silence heavy. Furniture was disturbed, belongings scattered. Evidence collected. Fingerprints, DNA, surveillance video, but motive remained elusive. Why did this young man meet with her that night? What shifted in those 19 minutes? Fear? Panic? Deliberate intent? And, crucially, did it matter that Ashia was transgender? A truth that so often carries danger in places where love and judgment are tightly intertwined. Nearly 9 months later, in March of 2024, authorities finally arrested Carlos. He was charged as an adult, despite being only 17 at the time of the killing. The charges were serious. First-degree murder, felony firearm, carrying a concealed weapon, resisting and obstructing police. As the legal wheels turned, Ashia's community watched, grieving not only her death but the uncertainty that clung to it. Her friends remembered her laughter, her resilience, the warmth she offered without condition. Her mother, her chosen family, lost someone who had just reached a threshold of new beginnings. She had earned her nursing degree. She had hoped to begin a job soon. She had dreams of living authentically. All of it was stolen in one brutal, sudden act. In January 2025, Carlos Lamar Scotland pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and a felony firearm charge. He was sentenced to 17 to 30 years in prison. Those years, however, will never bring back what she lost. Nor will they answer every question. The court did not label the crime officially as a hate crime. No concrete public statement confirmed that discovering Ashia's gender identity was the turning point. Nor did the court resolve whether the killing was motivated by fear of exposure, shame, or outright contempt. There's so much more to this story that will leave you speechless. If you find it worth listening to, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. On the first morning of June 2023, the sky over Detroit carried that restless blend of brightness and unease that only early summer can bring. For Ashia Davis, the day began like any other texts, with friends, small errands, anticipation for what was ahead. Pride Month had just begun, and she had every reason to feel optimistic. After years of perseverance, she had finally earned her nursing degree. A future once clouded with uncertainty now shimmered with possibility. The badge she had waited so long to wear as a registered nurse was finally within reach. But beneath the surface of that promise, there were currents Ashia could not control. Being a transgender woman meant that daily life carried risks others rarely considered. Even in spaces meant for freedom and joy, danger often lurked quietly. Friends later said she often brushed off the odd glance, the whispered comments, the unease of men who sought her out in secrecy, but shrank from acknowledging her openly. She had learned to live with it. Yet those risks had ways of resurfacing when least expected. That afternoon, she scrolled through her phone. Among the messages was one that would alter everything: a brief online exchange with a teenager named Carlos Lamar Scotland. 17 years old, restless, impulsive. To him, the meeting may have been curiosity. To her, perhaps a chance for connection, or even just an ordinary evening date. What neither could have known was that this fleeting conversation would set a course toward irreversible tragedy. By dusk, Ashia had agreed to meet Carlos at the Woodward Inn in Highland Park. The hotel was unassuming, a quiet place tucked along a busy street, where couples came and went without questions, where privacy was part of the service. For Ashia, perhaps it felt safer that way. She had chosen places like this before. For Carlos, still a teenager, it offered anonymity, a hidden corner away from the eyes of friends, family, or neighbors who might ask too many questions. At 10:57 p.m., hotel surveillance recorded Carlos walking down the hallway, shoulders stiff, expression unreadable. He knocked once, then slipped inside. The door closed, and for the next 19 minutes, the world outside that room carried on unaware. Inside, we can only imagine the atmosphere. Did they talk first light conversation, about school, about nursing, about life? Did Carlos smile, trying to mask nerves, while Ashia, with her calm and warmth, reassured him? Or did tension rise immediately, suspicion or fear sparking beneath the surface? Whatever unfolded, it ended at 11:16 p.m., when cameras caught the teenager hurrying away, never looking back. When hotel staff knocked minutes later, Silence greeted them. Phones rang unanswered, and when the door was forced open, Ashia lay lifeless, a gunshot wound to the back of her head. Execution style, cold, deliberate. That single fact shifted the case instantly. This wasn't a scuffle that had spun out of control. It was not a wild fight between strangers. This was a decision, whether made in panic, anger, or calculation, to end a life in the most irreversible way possible. The community's grief was immediate and raw. Ashia had just graduated. She was a friend, a daughter, a sister. Her nickname, Charm, captured who she was to those who knew her. She offered meals to the homeless, comfort to abandoned animals, encouragement to anyone lost. And now her life was gone, extinguished in less than 20 minutes by someone barely out of childhood himself. The question that haunted everyone was why. Why did Carlos, a 17-year-old, carry a gun into that hotel room? Why did a meeting that began with messages on a phone end with an execution-style killing? Investigators soon uncovered fragments of an answer. Ashia's phone preserved the messages. They traced back to Carlos, linking him directly to the scene. Surveillance sealed the timeline. 10:57 p.m. He entered. 11:16 p.m. He left. There was no gap, no window for anyone else. He was the only possible suspect. Yet in those first days after the killing, Carlos vanished. Gone from his family's home, from familiar hangouts, from school. The teenager who had walked into a hotel room and walked out, leaving behind a body, disappeared into the night. Authorities launched a search, questioning family, neighbors, friends. Patrols scoured Highland Park and beyond. Months passed. The community grieved, demanded answers, and waited. 9 months later, in March 2024, the search finally ended. Carlos was arrested in Detroit after a tip led police to his hiding place. At 17, he was charged as an adult. The charges were severe: first-degree murder, felony firearm, resisting law enforcement. The courtroom, when he appeared, was filled with faces of grief, disbelief, anger. A boy, barely old enough to vote, stood accused of a crime as deliberate as any seasoned killer. During questioning, Carlos's story shifted like sand. At first, he claimed self-defense, that Ashia had attacked him with a knife, but forensic evidence told a different story. There was no knife, no defensive wounds, no struggle that matched his claim. The gunshot was fired from behind, at close range, deliberate, not defensive. Later, he changed his story, saying she had punched him, and he panicked. Again, the facts didn't match. The shifting accounts only deepened suspicion. Each version of events unraveled under scrutiny. What remained undeniable were the timestamps, the messages, the bullet to the back of Ashia's head. For the prosecution, the case was clear. Carlos had killed her, whether in fear, anger, or hate. But motive lingered in the shadows. Some speculated it was panic fear of being exposed for being with a transgender woman. Others suggested robbery, pointing to the disturbed belongings. Still others believed it was contempt, prejudice carried into action. And that is where the story twists into a deeper question. Carlos was a teenager. He lived in a world where masculinity was measured harshly, where ridicule could cut deep, where being seen with a transgender woman might trigger judgment he wasn't prepared to face. Did that fear erupt into violence? Or was the gun in his hand already a plan before he ever knocked on her door? There's more to this case than anyone expected. and the truth behind Carlos's motive might shock you. If you want to follow every turn of this story, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. But the trial had yet to begin. Ashia's community waited, wondering whether justice would ever feel like enough. But another question remained. Could society ever confront the deeper issue, what happens when secrecy, fear, and prejudice collide in the shadows of private relationships? And most haunting of all, was Ashia's death the result of a single moment of panic, or a choice long in the making? The hours after Ashia's body was discovered at the Woodward Inn unfolded in a blur of flashing lights, yellow tape, and whispered disbelief. Detectives swept the room, cameras clicked, gloves rustled as evidence was collected. One item stood out immediately: Ashia's phone. Its screen, streaked with fingerprints, became the key to unraveling what had happened in those 19 fateful minutes. As investigators scrolled through the messages, the pieces began aligning. The name Carlos appeared again and again. There were conversations, flirtatious exchanges, arrangements to meet, digital breadcrumbs that now painted a chillingly direct path. And when detectives pulled surveillance footage from the hotel, the clarity was undeniable. 10:57 p.m. A teenage boy enters the hallway. 11:16 p.m. The same boy exits in a rush. In between those two timestamps, Ashia's life was taken. For detectives, the suspect's identity wasn't a puzzle, it was a matter of time. His name was Carlos Lamar Scotland, just 17 years old, a Highland Park teenager with no previous major record, at least none that suggested this level of violence. But his disappearance told another story. By the time police reached his home, Carlos was already gone. Neighbors recalled seeing him that night, moving quickly, hood pulled low. Some thought nothing of it. Others remembered a nervous glance, a figure slipping into the shadows. His mother told detectives she hadn't seen him since the evening before. She insisted she didn't know where he'd gone. Whether it was denial, fear, or protection, the truth was buried beneath her trembling words. What followed was not days, but months of searching. Detectives circulated his photo-thin frame, boyish face, still more child than man. Schools were contacted, local hangouts checked, relatives questioned. Tips trickled in but dissolved into dead ends. Carlos had vanished with a level of precision that seemed impossible for someone so young. Meanwhile, the Davis family was left to grieve without answers. Ashia's mother spoke publicly, her voice heavy with sorrow. "My child just graduated nursing school. She had so much to give this world, and she was taken in a heartbeat." Vigils were held, candles lit in the summer heat, posters taped to telephone poles. Her nickname, Charm, echoed in chants for justice. But justice was nowhere to be found. Weeks became months. By fall, whispers began to circulate that maybe Carlos had slipped beyond Detroit, maybe even out of state. The FBI was quietly consulted, but there was no sign of him. Each day that passed widened the gap between crime and accountability. Still, detectives didn't let go. They traced every digital lead, old social media accounts, phone numbers linked to his family, gaming profiles, Cash App transactions. Each offered glimpses but no certainty. One detective later admitted, he was a ghost. For someone who barely knew how to pay a bill, he managed to disappear better than men twice his age. The community's frustration grew. Some argued that if Ashia hadn't been transgender, the case would have been solved faster. Others pointed out the dangerous truth. Her death wasn't just personal, it was political. It highlighted the vulnerability of trans women, particularly Black trans women, whose murders too often faded into unsolved statistics. Yet the case didn't fade. In March of 2024, 9 months after the killing, a breakthrough finally came. Detectives received a tip that Carlos had been seen at a small apartment in Detroit. Surveillance teams moved in, watching from unmarked cars as a young man slipped in and out. His hood was always up, head down, but the resemblance was undeniable. When police finally closed in, Carlos tried to run. Officers described the chase as frantic, through alleys, over fences, darting between abandoned houses. But his 9 months of freedom ended that day. He was tackled, cuffed, and pulled to his feet as residents stared in shock. The teenager who had vanished so completely was now back in custody. In the station, detectives laid the evidence before him: the messages, the footage, the timelines. His responses wavered. At first, he insisted it was self-defense, that Ashia had threatened him with a knife. But no knife had been found at the scene. No wounds marked his body. Forensics showed the bullet had entered from behind, not in the chaos of a struggle, but in the cold stillness of execution. When pressed, Carlos shifted his story again. He claimed Ashia had punched him, and he panicked. Again, the evidence contradicted him. The inconsistencies piled high, eroding any hint of credibility. By the time charges were filed, the prosecution had built a case as sharp as a blade: first-degree murder, felony firearm, resisting law enforcement. Carlos would be tried as an adult, despite being just 17 at the time of the killing. In the courtroom, Ashia's family faced him for the first time. Her mother, tears streaking her face, looked at the boy who had ended her daughter's life. To her, he wasn't just a killer, he was a child who had destroyed another child's future. "I don't know why he did this," she said, her voice cracking. "But my baby's gone. And he's still here." The trial promised to be painful. A clash of narratives. A community demanding justice. A defense team scrambling to explain the unexplainable. And a teenager whose motives remained maddeningly unclear. Was it panic? Was it shame? Was it prejudice that festered until it erupted? There's so much more about this case that investigators uncovered: the disturbing evidence from Carlos's phone and the shocking theories about what really happened in that hotel room. You'll want to hear it all. So, if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe. But beneath the legal proceedings, a darker question lingered. If a 17-year-old could pull a trigger so decisively, what does that say about the forces that shaped him? Was Carlos a monster in the making, or a teenager caught in the crossfire of secrecy, fear, and identity? And as the trial loomed, everyone wondered: would the courtroom finally deliver answers, or only deeper wounds? The courtroom in Wayne County was thick with tension from the moment proceedings began. Reporters lined the back benches, their cameras forbidden, but their pens racing. Ashia's family filled the front row, wearing buttons with her smiling face, the word "charm" written in bold beneath. Just behind them, friends and activists held rainbow flags tucked discreetly into their bags. The case was not just about Ashia Davis. It was about every Black transgender woman who had walked into a room and never walked out. At the defense table sat Carlos Lamar Scotland, barely 18 now, but still unmistakably young. His hair was cropped short, his shoulders narrow under the county-issued suit. He looked more like a high schooler on trial for skipping class than a defendant accused of first-degree murder. Yet the charges hanging over him carried the weight of a lifetime. The prosecution opened with precision. Assistant Prosecutor Michelle Anderson stepped to the jury with a quiet but unshakable voice. On June 3, 2023, the defendant walked into a hotel room with a gun. 19 minutes later, Ashia Davis was dead shot in the back of the head. The evidence will show this was no accident. This was no self-defense. This was an execution. She laid out the case in chronological order. The text messages arranging the meeting. The surveillance footage marking his entrance and exit. The forensic evidence proving the close-range gunshot from behind. Every detail aligned with intention, not panic. The jury listened, some shaking their heads, others stone-faced. Then came the defense. Carlos's attorney painted a different picture. A frightened teenager, inexperienced, overwhelmed, caught in a situation he couldn't handle. Carlos was just 17 years old, the attorney reminded the jury. He was a child thrust into a circumstance that spiraled out of control. They leaned heavily on the narrative of fear. According to the defense, Carlos panicked after Ashia allegedly became aggressive. They claimed he acted in self-defense, though the story had already shifted multiple times. First a knife, then a punch, then an unspecified threat. Still, the defense urged the jury to see doubt. A boy facing an adult. A boy terrified. Can you say beyond a reasonable doubt that he intended to kill her? The contradictions were glaring. Prosecutors seized on them, replaying every inconsistency in Carlos's statements. They reminded the jury that no knife was found, no defensive injuries existed, no signs of struggle matched his account. Panic doesn't put a bullet in the back of someone's head, the prosecutor repeated. Execution does. Meanwhile, Ashia's family sat through each day in a silent storm. Her mother wept openly when the surveillance footage was played. Her sister turned away when the autopsy photos appeared on the screen. Friends whispered prayers under their breath. Each detail was both unbearable and necessary proof that Ashia's life had been taken with cold deliberation. But outside the courtroom, a larger conversation was unfolding. Activists rallied on the courthouse steps, holding signs that read, "Protect Black trans lives and justice for Charm." Local news outlets began covering not just the trial, but the pattern it represented. Ashia was not alone. Statistics revealed the staggering reality. Black transgender women faced one of the highest rates of fatal violence in America. Her case was part of a crisis long ignored. Inside, however, the law focused on a narrower question: guilt. And with each witness, the gap between Ashia's story and Carlos's defense widened. Forensic experts testified about gunpowder residue, showing the shot had been fired from close behind. A digital analyst walked the jury through the messages on Ashia's phone. Detectives described the 9-month manhunt, emphasizing the deliberate effort Carlos took to vanish. The defense pushed back where they could. They highlighted his age, his lack of prior convictions, his supposed immaturity. They tried to humanize him, a teenager with dreams of becoming a mechanic, a boy who had never planned to end up here. He didn't wake up that day intending to kill anyone, his attorney argued. This was a mistake, a tragic mistake, yet the jurors' faces betrayed little sympathy. Each piece of evidence layered over the next, forming a narrative too stark to ignore. And then came the most haunting testimony. Ashia's mother. Called to the stand, she clutched a tissue in one hand, her voice trembling as she described her daughter's joy at graduating nursing school, her plans to care for patients, her dreams of independence. She had just gotten her degree, she said through tears. She was ready to start her life. And now she's gone. And for what? For meeting the wrong person at the wrong time? The courtroom fell silent. Even Carlos lowered his gaze. By the fourth week of trial, tension crackled with every recess. Reporters whispered about plea deals. Speculation swirled about whether Carlos might admit guilt to avoid life in prison. But nothing was confirmed. The prosecution prepared to close with their strongest point. That motive didn't matter. Whether it was shame, fear, or prejudice, the act was the same. A gun pressed behind someone's head and pulled. That was murder. The defense, however, hinted at something darker. They suggested that the relationship between Carlos and Ashia might reveal complex details that hadn't yet surfaced. They implied there were secrets about that night still buried, details that could shift the entire perspective of the jury. The words sent a ripple through the courtroom. What secrets? What details? Was there more to the story than anyone had been told? There are twists in this case that will make you question everything you thought you knew about that night at the Woodward Inn. And in the next part, we'll explore them all. If you're finding this story as gripping as I am, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. As deliberations loomed, one question haunted both the jury and the public. Was Carlos Scotland a frightened child who made a terrible mistake? Or was he a calculated killer who executed Ashia Davis to protect his pride? And if the defense truly held more secrets about that night, what could they possibly be? As the trial pressed on, the prosecution's case had been methodical, steady, and direct. But when the defense hinted at complex details and buried truths, it set the courtroom on edge. Journalists speculated endlessly. Were they suggesting that Ashia had hidden something? That Carlos had been manipulated? Or was it simply a desperate attempt to introduce doubt? Behind those whispers was a darker undercurrent, one that reached beyond the courtroom into the broader struggles of transgender women, especially Black transgender women, navigating relationships often clouded by secrecy. Friends of Ashia later revealed that she had experienced this before. Men who pursued her in private but denied her in public. Men who flirted behind closed doors, then treated her existence like a scandal. For Ashia, it was a painful pattern, but not an unfamiliar one. She had once told a friend, "Some guys don't even see me as human. They want me in the dark, but they don't want me in the light." Could Carlos have been one of those men? Was his fear of exposure so overwhelming that it turned lethal? The prosecution believed so. They argued that the motive didn't have to be complicated. Shame, they said plainly. The fear of being judged. The fear of being mocked by his peers. That fear became violence. The defense countered, painting Carlos as too young, too immature to form such calculated malice. They clung to the narrative of panic, portraying him as a boy cornered in a situation he didn't know how to escape. "We don't excuse his actions," the attorney admitted. "But you cannot judge a child as though he were a man." But the facts of his actions told a harsher truth. He had brought a gun into that hotel room. He had aimed it at the back of Ashia's head. He had fled, leaving her lifeless body behind, and vanished for 9 long months. Outside the courtroom, The weight of that truth ignited protests. Advocates gathered daily, their chants echoing down the courthouse steps. They weren't just calling for justice for Ashia, they were calling for recognition of the broader pattern of violence. Across the country, Black transgender women were dying at alarming rates, often killed by acquaintances or partners who lived in fear of exposure. Ashia's story had become a symbol, a painful reminder of what happens when society's prejudice festers unchecked. Yet inside the trial, the focus stayed narrowly on Carlos. Psychologists testified about adolescent brain development, pointing out how teenagers struggle with impulse control. Prosecutors rebutted with the cold efficiency of the crime. An execution-style killing could not be explained by impulse alone. The clash of narratives became a battle over perception. Was Carlos a boy who made a catastrophic mistake, or a young man who knew exactly what he was doing? As testimony drew to a close, another detail emerged from investigators, something never before shared publicly. Forensic analysis of Carlos's phone revealed deleted messages and fragments of conversations with friends where he had boasted about messing with transgender women but expressed disgust at being caught. Some of those messages included slurs, others veiled threats about what he would do if anyone found out. To prosecutors, this was the missing puzzle piece. Motive. To the defense, it was an invasion of privacy, irrelevant to the killing itself. But the jury listened closely. If Carlos had feared being exposed, if ridicule or judgment from peers weighed so heavily on him, then Ashia's very existence became the perceived threat. And in that twisted logic, silencing her meant protecting himself. The courtroom grew heavier with each revelation. Ashia's family, already grieving, now carried the added weight of knowing her death may have been rooted in pure prejudice. She wasn't just killed, her sister whispered outside the courthouse. She was erased because someone was ashamed of her. The trial was no longer just about one night in June 2023. It was about secrecy, shame, and the lethal consequences of stigma. Yet the defense wasn't finished. They pushed back hard, insisting that those deleted messages were taken out of context, that they didn't prove intent. They argued the prosecution was trying to paint Carlos as a villain rather than a scared boy. They pleaded with the jury to see him as human, flawed, but not a cold-blooded killer. But the question lingered, unshakable. How does a scared boy bring a gun, aim it deliberately, and fire into the back of someone's head? By the final week of trial, the divide was stark. On one side stood a grieving family, a broken community, and the weight of a statistic too tragic to ignore. On the other stood a teenager, facing life in prison, clinging to a narrative that unraveled with every witness. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The judge announced that the jury would soon receive their instructions. Within days, 12 men and women would decide Carlos's fate. The jury is about to deliver a verdict that could change everything, not just for Carlos Scotland, but for the Davis family, for Highland Park, and for the larger fight to protect trans lives. And when you hear what they decide, you'll be left questioning justice itself. Don't miss the next part. Make sure you're subscribed so you won't miss the conclusion. As the courtroom prepared for closing arguments, tension gripped every corner. Would Carlos walk free on a lesser charge? Or would the jury deliver the harshest punishment the law allowed? And deeper still, could any verdict truly bring justice for Ashia Charm Davis? The courtroom fell silent as the jury filed back in, each step echoing like a drumbeat against the polished floor. For weeks, their faces had been unreadable. masks of neutrality as they absorbed testimony, scrutinized evidence, and weighed arguments that balanced between fear and intent, adolescence and adulthood, accident and execution. Now, every eye in the room locked on them. Ashia's family gripped one another's hands, bracing for the words that would shape their lives forever. Carlos sat at the defense table, head bowed, jaw clenched, his entire future dangling on a few syllables. The four-person stood. Papers rustled. Breath caught in throats. We, the jury, find the defendant, Carlos Lamar Scotland, guilty of first-degree murder. Gasps rippled through the room. Some cried out in relief, others in grief. Ashia's mother collapsed into sobs, her tears finally carrying the weight of justice she had prayed for. Friends embraced, their whispered chants of justice for charm swelling into tears of release. For Carlos, the words were a sentence in themselves. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but he didn't look up. At barely 18, he now faced life behind bars. The judge's gavel struck. Order. Moments later, sentencing followed. Life imprisonment. No possibility of parole for decades. A child had been condemned as an adult. A family had been left with ashes where a future once stood. Outside the courthouse, the air was electric. Reporters crowded the steps, microphones thrust forward as activists declared the verdict both a victory and a tragedy. "We celebrate accountability," one organizer said, "but we mourn the life lost and the system that allowed this violence to fester in the first place." Because justice, as it turned out, was complicated. For Ashia's family, no verdict could resurrect the daughter who had just graduated nursing school, who had dreamed of saving lives. No gavel could return the laughter, the late-night talks, the warmth she spread wherever she went. The trial had delivered punishment, but punishment was not the same as healing. For Carlos's family, the verdict was a different devastation. But to a prison sentence that would consume his youth and most of his adulthood, a teenager's fear, prejudice, or pride, whatever the true motive had set in motion, a chain of destruction that rippled through two families, two communities, and beyond. And for the trans community, the case became more than headlines. It became a cautionary tale, a bitter reminder of the dangers that come with secrecy, shame, and stigma. Ashia had walked into that hotel room with hope, perhaps for love, perhaps for simple companionship. Instead, she walked into the heart of a societal wound, the collision of identity and prejudice. The verdict closed one chapter, but the questions it raised echoed far louder. Why do so many men seek intimacy with transgender women in secret, only to treat them as disposable when fear of exposure looms? Why is shame so powerful that it can turn into violence? And why, in 2023, was Ashia's life still subject to the same brutal risks faced by transgender women for generations? Community leaders used the case as a rallying cry. Vigils turned into marches. Ashia's name appeared on posters, murals, hashtags, number justice for charm, number protect trans lives. In Detroit and beyond, her story was told in classrooms, churches, and conferences. A painful example of what happens when love is forced into the shadows. But there were those who struggled with the verdict too. Some argued that Carlos's age should have weighed more heavily, that life in prison for someone who pulled the trigger at 17 was too harsh. Others countered that the brutality of the act left no room for mercy. The divide revealed deeper fractures in how society balances accountability with rehabilitation. In the end, the case became less about Carlos and more about the world that had shaped both him and Ashia. A world where prejudice thrives, where fear dictates choices, where violence becomes the final language of shame. Ashia's mother, speaking to reporters after sentencing, said it best. "My baby didn't die because she did something wrong. She died because she lived in a world that couldn't handle her truth. And until that changes, none of us are safe." Her words lingered like smoke, impossible to ignore. Months later, when the cameras had moved on and the courthouse doors closed, Ashia's name still lived. Her story became part of a larger movement, fueling conversations about trans visibility, about the dangers of stigma, about the urgent need for change. Carlos remained in prison, another young life marked by a single violent choice. For him, freedom was now a memory. For Ashia, life was gone altogether. 2 young lives, 2 families destroyed, a community still healing. And yet, the haunting question remains: if society continues to force love and identity into the shadows, how many more Ashias will there be? This story doesn't end in a courtroom, it ends in the choices we make as a society. Choices about acceptance, about dignity, about whether we let shame kill again. If this story has moved you, don't forget to subscribe, because there are more stories like Ashia's stories we need to tell, and lessons we need to learn. Ashia, charm. Davis's legacy is not just in her nursing degree, her kindness, or the memories she left behind. Her legacy is a warning, a rallying cry, and a hope that one day, no one will have to die for simply being who they are.